Welcome to Orbits and Oracles, a griot's guide to history. This is Empire Rising, the Roaring Twenties. This isn't, of course, your standard history lecture. And we're bringing the past and all its grit, gram, and game-changing moments from the 20s to your ears. I'll be your personal guide through this chaos, creativity, and cultural shift that made the 1920s one of the most electrifying decades in history. Flappers, jazz, rebellions, and reckonings. Let's get into it. But first, let's go back a year. Causes: fear of communism after the Russian Revolution. After the Russian Revolution of 1917, the world watched as Bolsheviks overthrew the Russian monarchy and proclaimed a communist government. This seismic shift threw shockwaves through capitalist nations, especially the United States. By 1919, the American public, government, and press were gripped by a fear that communism could spread to the United States soil. Worker strikes, anarchist bombings, and increased immigration from Eastern Europe were all seen as evidence of an impending leftist revolution. This panic, of course, was known as Red Scare, and red symbolized the color of communism. Just to give you a sense of scale, over 3,600 strikes occurred in 1919 alone, involving more than 4 million workers. When the Boston police went on strike in September of that year, chaos and crime spiked. Too many Americans, it looked like society was unraveling. What really lit the fuse was the Palmer raids, which was a series of anarchist bombings in 1919. One of them targeted none other than the U.S. Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer. A bomb exploded outside of his Washington, D.C. home, of course, shattering windows and terrifying his neighbors. Palmer survived, but the attack left a mark, not just physically, but politically. He vowed to root out what he called the Bolshevik menace. So beginning in November of 1919 and peaking in January of 1920, Palmer led a sweeping campaign against suspected communists, anarchists, and leftist labor organizations. The raids were conducted by the Justice Department under government authority, under the direction of the very young and ambitious J. Edgar Hoover. Tens of thousands of people were arrested without warrants. Homes were ransacked. Immigrants suspected of radical beliefs were deported. Most famous anarchists were Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman. Due process went completely out of the window. Many were detained for weeks without being charged. Courts were bypassed. In short, civil liberties were trampled in the name of national security. This was all justified up under the Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918, wartime laws that were now being applied in peacetime. Now, initially, most of the public supported Palmer's crackdown, but over time, especially after his dramatic prediction of a May Day communist uprising in 1920 failed to materialize, the mood began to shift. The public began to recognize that the government was using propaganda to implement additional policies or implement wartime policies during a time outside of war. Critics of Congress and the press began to speak out. The American Civil Liberties Union, which is the ACLU, was founded in response to these raids, aiming to protect constitutional rights that had been so blatantly ignored. Especially Palmer lost credibility and the hysteria began to fade, but not before leaving a lasting scar on American civil liberties. The Red Scare set a dangerous precedent. It showed how fear could override the Constitution, how national security could be used to justify mass violations of individual rights, and it wouldn't be the last time America would go down this road. Let us think McCarthyism that is coming in the 1950s and the Patriot Act immediately following 9/11. So what was the cause of the Red Scare? The fear of communism after Russian Revolution, labor unrest, anarchist bombings. The effect was the Palmer raids, mass arrests, deportation, and civil liberties violations. What were the long-term implications of the Red Scare? The rise of the FBI, the founding of the ACLU, and a pattern of repression during national crisis. The 19th Amendment, a win for women, but not all women. Picture it, August 18, 1920. After decades of fighting, marching, hunger strikes, and straight up refusing to be ignored, women finally secured the right to vote. But let's keep it real, it wasn't a win for all women. The suffrage movement had deep roots, but it was far from unified. Black women like Ida B. Wells and Mary Church Terrell were out here demanding their place in democracy, even as white suffragists tried to push them into the margin. The win was major, but the struggle wasn't over, especially for women of color, who would keep fighting for their voting rights well into the civil rights era. The 19th Amendment was a step forward, but it wasn't the finish line. Black women had to keep pushing to make democracy work for them. Meanwhile, up in Harlem, something magnetic was happening. The Great Migration brought waves of black folks to northern cities, and with them came a revolution of music, literature, and art. This wasn't just a moment, it was a movement. Langston Hughes was putting the black experience on paper with lines like "I Too Sing America." Duke Ellington was telling everybody, hey, don't forget to take the A train, and Zora Neale Hurston was writing in between the margins, documenting black life with all its beauty and complexity.
The Harlem Renaissance is one of the most iconic cultural periods in African American history. Throughout the decade of the 1920s, black writing, art, and music flourished, ushering in a cultural revolution that rocked the United States.
One of the most important factors that accounted for the rise of what we know of as the Harlem Renaissance is the migration of black peoples from the South to urban centers like Harlem.
The Jim Crow era begins after Reconstruction, and every Southern African American had to think about, what should we do? Should we go or should we stay? For many of these people, it was a matter of life and death, literally.
Sometimes in the most repressive times, we create the most extraordinary art.
Thank you, Ms. Jones and Ms. Wilkerson, for giving us more insight into the Harlem Renaissance. The Harlem Renaissance was truly more than art. It was about self-definition. Black creatives finally had the chance to tell their own stories on their own terms. Now, for most people, the 20s, America was out here living large, stock markets booming, consumer culture popping, and the idea that the good times would never end. But like all things, everything ends. In this case, it ended hard and fast. October 29th, 1929, Black Tuesday, the stock market nosedived, banks failed, and suddenly the American dream felt more like a nightmare. Greedy speculation, risky loans, and unchecked capitalism left the country on the brink. Bread lines wrapped around city blocks. Families lost everything overnight, and yet, like always, Black, indigenous, and Black communities who had already been locked out of the prosperity of the 20s were hit even harder. Let's hear from one of my favorite experts about the 1929 stock market crash.
Black Tuesday 1929 was actually the climax of the most difficult week Wall Street had ever seen. On October 24th, there had been almost a free fall in the morning. The bankers and the big men on Wall Street rallied and started buying, and it seemed like a heroic rescue of the market. Then on Monday, it was a devastating day, the worst day in the market ever. So then Black Tuesday dawned with people just almost immobilized with fear.
The tremendous crowds which you see gathered outside the stock exchange are due to the greatest crash in the history of the New York Stock Exchange in market prices.
People who were buying on margin, essentially paying only 10 to 20% of the total cost for a stock while borrowing the rest, were wiped out when they were called to pay back those loans. By 1933, almost half of America's banks had failed. Unemployment rose to 25%. The Great Depression had set in.
So it was the opening act in what became a horrific 2.5-year period in the market. People had lost jobs and couldn't buy. People were afraid of losing jobs and were afraid to buy. And business was afraid of expanding because nobody was buying.
The economy was in a free fall. The aftermath of the stock market crash and the Great Depression would take its toll. Soup lines and unemployment lines became commonplace. Fear and depression were everywhere.
Finally, I think there was a psychological impact of Black Tuesday and the days that had preceded it that cannot be underestimated. While it's true that only a few people participated in the stock market, it had become a spectator sport for the entire nation. So the devastation on Black Tuesday wiped out the fantasies of an entire nation, the fantasy that you could get rich quickly by investing in stocks, and more importantly, the fantasy that there were big men, powerful bankers and brokers who could somehow intervene in the financial system and rescue the stock market.
A series of financial reforms by newly elected President Franklin D. Roosevelt would help the economy improve. But it was actually economic activity fueled by World War II that eventually helped end the Great Depression.
Thank you, Ms. Enriquez, for your expert opinion. As mentioned in Professor Enriquez's clip, Franklin D. Roosevelt entered stage left in 1933. He rolls out with the New Deal, a series of policies aimed at dragging the country out of its economic freefall. Public workers programs like the CCC and the WPA put people back to work, while Social Security created a safety net still holding today. What is the CCC? The Civil Conservation Corps, established in 1933. The CCC was designed to provide employment for young unemployed men and address the environmental concerns. Participants in the CCC worked on projects such as reforestation, flood control, park development, and road construction. Over 3 million men worked in the CCC, and the program was particularly significant for its dual focus on unemployment relief and environmental conservation. It helped restore the nation's natural resources and also provided much-needed financial support to struggling families. The effect? The CCC played a vital role in boosting morale during the Great Depression and provided a sense of purpose to young men who might otherwise have been without work or direction. It also introduced the concept of federal work programs as a tool for economic relief. The WPA administration, which is the Workers' Progress Administration, was established in 1935, created to provide jobs for the unemployed through public works projects. It funded constructions of roads, bridges, schools, and other infrastructure, as well as projects in the arts, theater, and writing. The WPA employed millions of people during the 1930s and was one of the largest and most ambitious of the New Deal programs. In addition to providing jobs, the WPA helped create lasting public infrastructure that benefited future generations. Think libraries, museums, parks, not just your regular parks, but your parks with actual activities in them. Community centers. It also helped artists, musicians, and writers, giving them work during economic crisis. The WPA helped reduce unemployment, provided essential public infrastructure, and left a cultural legacy through its support for the arts. Think Kennedy Center. The program demonstrated the federal government's ability to intervene directly in the economy and provide relief to a wide range of people. The Social Security Act of 1935. Now, the Social Security Act was one of the most significant reforms of the New Deal. It aimed to provide financial support to the elderly, disabled, and unemployed. The Act created a system of old age pension, unemployment insurance, and assistance for widows and children. The Social Security Act represented a shift in how the U.S. government approached social welfare. For the first time, the federal government established a system of support for individuals unable to work due to age, disability, or other factors. The Act laid the foundation for future Social Security safety nets in the U.S. Its long-term effect is that it provided a sense of security for millions of Americans. While the program initially provided limited benefits, it grew over time and became a cornerstone of the American welfare state. It also set a precedent for government intervention in the personal economic well-being of its citizens, shaping future policies related to health, retirement, and unemployment. But let's not sugarcoat it. The New Deal didn't solve everything, and it definitely wasn't built for everyone. Black workers often were shut out of benefits. Indigenous communities were still being displaced, and the road to recovery wasn't smooth. Still, this moment reshaped the role of government and planted seeds for future fights for equity and justice. The New Deal proved that the government intervention could provide relief, but it also showed us whose suffering was prioritized and whose suffering was not. So what's our takeaway? In the 1920s, that the 1920s was about reinvention, politically, artistically, and economically, but they were also about imbalance, a boom and a bust, a resistance and a repression, progress and exclusion. Sounds familiar? The empire rising and the echoes of the roaring 20s are still bouncing around today. From economic inequality to cultural revolution, history isn't just something we study. It's something we live. It's always been amazing. Make sure you complete the questions at the end of the podcast. And like always, I need you to stay curious, stay critically thinking, and happy reading.